I stood shivering on the cold, unforgiving curb, my simple thrifted coat soaked completely through by the freezing rain, while my blind date, Julian, rolled down the tinted window of his luxury sedan. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh, calling me a pathetic charity case in front of the valets before aggressively hitting the gas and splashing icy puddle water all over my shoes. He drove away into the stormy night, feeling incredibly smug and victorious. He had absolutely no idea that he had just abandoned the Duchess of the city. Trust me, you won't believe what happens next. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. My name is Alara. To the vast majority of the people in the grand, sprawling metropolis of Oakhaven, I was a phantom, an untouchable figurehead, a name spoken with a mixture of profound reverence and fearful respect. I was the Duchess of Oakhaven. My family had overseen the economic and cultural development of the region for nearly 4 centuries. We owned the land beneath the glittering skyscrapers, funded the sprawling central libraries, and held the deciding votes on the city's massive infrastructural grants. But beneath the diamond tiaras, the endless charity galas, the suffocating board meetings, and the constant blinding flash of paparazzi cameras, I was just a 26-year-old woman who was incredibly, deeply lonely. I was exhausted. I was tired of men looking at me and seeing only a walking bank vault, a stepping stone to unimaginable social status, or a trophy to be paraded around elite country clubs. I wanted to be loved for who I was, in the dark, quiet moments, not for the title attached to my name. I was grieving the recent loss of my father, the former Duke, and the pressure of the crown was crushing me. I needed an escape. I needed to know if humanity still had genuine warmth left in it. So, I created a second life. It wasn't anything overly dramatic, just a quiet, unassuming existence. A few days a week, I would leave the sprawling ancestral estate in the hills, trade my bespoke designer gowns for faded jeans and oversized knitted sweaters, and take the subway down into the heart of the city. I volunteered at a small community center on the Lower East Side, organizing books, serving hot meals to the unhoused, and talking to everyday people. I went by the name Ella. I told people I was a part-time librarian and a freelance tutor trying to make ends meet. For the first time in my entire life, I felt invisible. And it was absolute, pure freedom. It was during this time that a well-meaning friend from my ordinary life set me up on a blind date. She told me he was a successful, driven young man who worked in finance. "He's very ambitious, Ella," she had said, her eyes shining with excitement. "He needs someone grounding, someone sweet like you to balance him out." I agreed. I was hopeful. I wanted to see if I could connect with someone without the heavy golden shadow of my title looming over the dinner table. If you love stories about karma, hidden identities, and satisfying revenge, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss how this unfolds. The evening of the date was bitterly cold, the sky a bruised, heavy purple that threatened a torrential downpour. I arrived at Laura, one of the most exclusive, ridiculously overpriced French restaurants in the city's financial district. I knew the owner. I had personally signed the permits for his outdoor terrace expansion 3 years ago, but as Ella, I kept my head down. I was wearing a simple, modest navy blue dress I had bought off the rack at a mid-tier department store, paired with a tan trench coat that had seen better days. I wore minimal makeup. I wanted to present myself as ordinary, unpretentious, and real. Julian was already seated at a corner booth when the hostess led me over. Even from 20 feet away, I could read everything about him. He was wearing a sharply tailored, expensive charcoal suit. His hair was perfectly, immaculately styled, not a single strand out of place. A massive, ostentatious silver watch gleamed on his left wrist, the kind of watch designed specifically to make sure everyone in the room knew how much it cost. As I approached the table, he didn't stand up. He didn't even fully lower his phone. He simply looked up, his eyes doing a slow, excruciatingly judgmental sweep from the top of my slightly frizzy hair down to the scuff marks on my practical leather boots. I saw the exact moment his interest died. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, hard calculation. "Ella?" he asked, his tone flat, entirely devoid of the charm I had been promised. "Yes." "Hi, Julian. It's so nice to finally meet you," I said, offering a warm, genuine smile as I slid into the booth across from him. He offered a tight, forced smile in return, finally putting his phone face down on the table. "You're different from what I expected. Sarah didn't mention your, personal style." "I like to keep things comfortable," I replied mildly, unfolding my napkin and placing it in my lap. I chose to ignore the slight. I was here to give him a fair chance. "So, Sarah tells me you're a senior analyst at Sterling Wealth Management?" For the next 45 minutes, I barely had to speak. Julian launched into a relentless, unbroken monologue about himself. He talked about his portfolio, his recent promotions, the expensive sports car he was thinking of importing from Germany, and the elite social circles he was actively trying to break into. He name-dropped minor city officials and local celebrities with a desperate hunger that I found utterly exhausting. He judged worth entirely by surface signals. He cared about the labels on clothes, the addresses of apartments, and the prestige of family names. He was the exact type of person I spent my days avoiding in the high society ballrooms. "It's all about networking, Ella," Julian said, taking a sip of his $90 glass of Merlot, swirling it aggressively in the crystal glass. "You have to project success to attract success. The people in this city, the ones who actually matter, like the Duke's estate and the inner council, they only respect power. You have to look like you belong in the room before they even open the door for you." I took a quiet sip of my sparkling water. "Do you think that's true? That people only respect power? What about character? What about kindness?" Julian laughed. It wasn't a warm sound. It was harsh, cynical, and condescending. "Kindness is for people who can't afford to be powerful, Ella. It's a coping mechanism for the lower classes. Speaking of which, Sarah was incredibly vague about what you actually do. You said you work at a library?" "I volunteer at the East Side Community Center," I said softly, my voice steady. "I help organize the literacy programs, and I do some freelance tutoring for kids in the neighborhood who are struggling." Julian stared at me. The silence stretched between us, heavy and incredibly uncomfortable. He looked at me as if I had just confessed to carrying a highly contagious disease. "You volunteer?" he repeated slowly, tasting the word as if it were sour milk. "So, you don't actually have a real career path? You're just playing charity worker on minimum wage?" "I find the work incredibly fulfilling," I said, maintaining my composure. My hands were resting in my lap, my posture perfectly straight, a habit drilled into me by years of etiquette training. "I help people who genuinely need it. I don't measure my success by my tax bracket, Julian." His expression hardened into a mask of pure disgust. "Right. Well, that's now quaint. But let's be realistic, Ella. We are clearly not in the same league. I'm on a trajectory to become a partner at my firm. I'm aiming for the top of Oak Haven society. I need a partner who can stand beside me at galas, someone who understands wealth, someone who commands respect, not someone who smells like old library books in soup kitchens." The words landed like a physical blow. But my composure didn't crack. I just looked at him, studying the cruel, shallow lines of his face. "I see," I said simply. Before I could say another word, Julian signaled the waiter. "Check, please, separate." When the bill arrived, he threw down his black metallic credit card to cover his steak and wine. He pointedly ignored the small charge for my sparkling water and side salad. I calmly reached into my purse, pulled out a $20 bill, and placed it on the table. I have early meetings tomorrow, Julian announced, standing up and buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He didn't look at me. I think it's best we just end this here. Good luck with your volunteering. He turned and walked out of the restaurant without a backward glance. Have you ever been deeply underestimated or judged strictly by what you wear or what you do for a living? Drop a comment below and tell me your story. I read every single one. I sat in the booth for another 5 minutes, the ambient chatter of the restaurant buzzing around me. I wasn't angry, I was just profoundly disappointed. I gathered my worn trench coat, tipped the waiter generously with the remaining cash in my wallet, and stepped out the heavy glass doors of Laura. The weather had taken a severe turn for the worse. The heavy purple clouds had broken, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour. The wind was howling down the concrete canyons of the financial district, biting through my thin coat instantly. I stood under the small awning of the restaurant, shivering, pulling my collar up around my neck. I looked down the street. Julian's sleek black luxury sedan was pulled up to the curb just a few feet away. The valet had just handed him his keys. He was sitting in the driver's seat, the engine purring softly. I took a step forward, raising my hand slightly. "Julian?" I called out over the sound of the rain. "The subway is closed on this line for repairs tonight. Could you possibly drop me off at the main transit hub? It's just 5 minutes up the road." Julian rolled down his passenger side window just an inch. The warm air from his car's heater blasted out into the freezing night. He looked at me standing there, soaked, shivering, looking small and entirely vulnerable. A cruel, arrogant smirk twisted his lips. "Sorry, Ella," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I just had this interior detailed, and frankly, I don't want wet, cheap clothes ruining the leather. Like I said inside, we aren't in the same league. Maybe you can use some of that character to keep you warm." He laughed, a sharp, ugly sound, called me a pathetic charity case, and slammed his foot on the accelerator. The tires squealed against the wet asphalt. A massive wave of icy, muddy water surged up from the gutter and completely drenched my legs and shoes. I gasped at the freezing shock of it, taking a step back, but it was too late. Julian's taillights disappeared into the storm. I stood there in the pouring rain, the water dripping from my hair, running down my face. I was completely alone. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. I didn't cry. I am a duchess. We do not cry in public, not even when the public is an empty, rain-slick street. Excuse me. The voice was deep, soft, and startlingly close. I opened my eyes and turned around. Standing a few feet away was a man. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit. He wore a dark canvas jacket, a simple scarf, and slightly damp jeans. He was holding a large, sturdy black umbrella. Before I could react, he stepped forward, extending his arms so the large canopy of the umbrella covered me, shielding me from the relentless, punishing rain. He didn't crowd me, he kept a respectful distance, but the immediate relief from the downpour was immense. "I saw what just happened," he said quietly. His eyes were a warm, dark amber, and they were filled with genuine concern, not pity. "I was walking out of the cafe across the street. That was incredibly cruel." I blinked, water still clinging to my eyelashes. "I'm fine, really. It's just water." "It's freezing water," he corrected gently. He looked down at my soaked boots, then back up to my face. "I'm Arthur. My car is parked just around the corner. The heater works exceptionally well. I can drive you wherever you need to go. No strings attached. I just can't, in good conscience, leave you standing here like this." I studied him. After a lifetime of dealing with sycophants, liars, and manipulators, I had developed a very sharp intuition for people's true intentions. Arthur's face was open, honest, and kind. There was no calculation in his gaze. He didn't know I was wealthy. He didn't know I had a title. He just saw a woman shivering in the rain, and his first instinct was to offer shelter. "I'm Ella," I said softly, wrapping my arms around myself to ward off the chill. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Ella," Arthur said, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Let's get you out of this storm." He walked beside me, keeping the umbrella perfectly angled so I remained dry, sacrificing his own shoulder to the rain in the process. His car was an older, slightly battered blue sedan. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't a status symbol, but when I slid into the passenger seat, the blast of hot air from the vents felt like an absolute luxury. Arthur got in, shaking the water from his hair. He turned the heat up higher and pulled a clean, dry towel from the back seat, offering it to me. "Thank you," I murmured, drying my face and hair. "The subway lines are a mess tonight," Arthur said, putting the car in drive. "Where can I take you?" "The main transit hub is fine," I lied. I couldn't exactly have him drive me to the massive gated royal estate in the hills. "Are you sure? You're freezing. There's a 24-hour diner about 10 blocks from here. Best hot chocolate in the city. I'd be happy to buy you a cup to help you thaw out before you brave the trains." I looked over at him. His hands were relaxed on the steering wheel. He wasn't pushing. He was just offering kindness. "Hot chocolate sounds wonderful," I admitted. "If you're loving this story so far and you want to see exactly how Julian gets what he deserves, don't go anywhere. This is where it gets incredibly good. Make sure you subscribe." We sat in the neon-lit diner for 3 hours. The contrast between Julian and Arthur was so stark it was almost dizzying. Arthur didn't talk about his portfolio or his trajectory. He told me he was an architect, working for a small independent firm that specialized in restoring historic buildings and building affordable, sustainable housing in low-income neighborhoods. "I like preserving the soul of the city," Arthur explained, swirling his coffee. "There's so much beauty in the old brick, in the history. Too many people just want to tear it all down and build shiny, soulless glass towers just to prove how much money they have." He looked at me, his amber eyes incredibly perceptive. "What about you, Ella? What brings you joy?" I told him about the community center. I told him about the kids I tutored. I talked about how much I love the smell of old paperbacks, the quiet peace of the early morning, the simple satisfaction of helping someone read their first full sentence. Arthur listened. He actually listened. He didn't dismiss my work as quaint. He asked insightful questions. He engaged with my mind. He treated me with an inherent, unwavering respect. "You have a very kind heart, Ella," Arthur said softly as the diner staff began wiping down the tables around us. "Whoever that guy was tonight, he's an absolute fool. He didn't see the value of the person sitting right in front of him." My breath hitched slightly in my throat. He saw me, the real me. Before the title, before the wealth, before the grand revelation. When Arthur finally drove me to the transit hub, we exchanged phone numbers. As I watched his taillights fade down the street, a stark contrast to how Julian had left me earlier, I felt a strange, profound warmth blossoming in my chest. Over the next 2 months, Arthur and I became inseparable. We went on walks through the city parks, ate street food, and spent hours in dusty used bookstores. He courted me with a quiet, steady devotion that I had never experienced in my life. He never pushed for more than I was willing to give. He respected my boundaries. And my secret, it became heavier every single day. I knew I was flawed for hiding the truth from him for so long, but I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified that the moment I told him I was the Duchess of Oakhaven, the dynamic would shatter. I feared he would look at me differently, with awe, with fear, or worse, with the same calculating greed I saw in everyone else's eyes. I wanted to hold on to Ella just a little bit longer. But destiny, as it often does, forced my hand. Have you ever kept a massive secret to protect a relationship? How did it turn out? Let me know in the comments. The Duchy of Oakhaven was preparing for its most significant event of the decade, the Royal Centenary Gala. It was an incredibly exclusive, highly publicized black tie event where the Duchy announced its major infrastructural grants and corporate partnerships for the next 5 years. Every elite businessman, politician, and social climber in the city would be there, desperately vying for a crumb of the Duchess's attention. I had been secretly reviewing the grant proposals from my private office at the estate. One of the largest proposals, requesting millions in city funding for a massive, soulless commercial development, came from Sterling Wealth Management, Julian's firm. In fact, Julian's name was listed as the lead analyst on the project. He was banking his entire career progression on this grant. 3 weeks before the grand gala, there was a preliminary charity mixer hosted by the city's architectural board. Arthur had invited me as his plus one. He was wearing a simple, well-fitting black suit, and I wore a classic, understated emerald green gown I had purchased from a vintage shop. The room was filled with the city's upper middle class, sipping champagne and networking. Arthur was proudly introducing me to his colleagues, his hand resting warmly, protectively on the small of my back. And then I heard the voice, well, if it isn't the charity case. I turned slowly. Julian was standing there holding a flute of champagne, flanked by two other sharply dressed men from his firm. He looked me up and down, a nasty, familiar smirk playing on his lips. "Julian," I said, my voice perfectly calm. Arthur stepped slightly forward, his jaw tightening. "Is there a problem here?" Julian laughed, looking at Arthur's modest suit. "No problem at all. I was just surprised to see Ella here. The architectural board usually has a slightly higher standard for their guest list. Didn't know they let the community center volunteers crash the open bar." Julian's colleagues snickered. Several people nearby turned to look, the murmur of conversation dying down as they sensed the conflict. "Ella is my guest," Arthur said, his voice low, dangerously quiet. "And she has more grace in her little finger than you have in your entire existence. I suggest you walk away." Julian's eyes flashed with anger. He hated being challenged, especially publicly, and especially by someone he deemed beneath him. "You must be her new charity project," Julian sneered at Arthur. He turned back to me, raising his voice so the surrounding crowd could clearly hear. "Honestly, Ella, it's pathetic. You scrounge around the bottom of the barrel, pretending you have some sort of moral high ground, when the reality is you're just poor. You contribute absolutely nothing of value to this city. People like me build Oakhaven. People like me are the reason this city thrives. You're just taking up space." The silence in our immediate circle was absolute. The humiliation hung heavy in the air. Arthur looked ready to physically throw Julian out of the room. He took a step forward, his fist clenched, but I reached out, gently placing my hand on his arm. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. My composure didn't crack. I simply looked at Julian with an expression of profound, icy pity. "You value nothing but surface, Julian," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. "You judge worth by bank accounts and job titles. You think cruelty is strength, but true power doesn't need to shout, and true wealth doesn't need to belittle others to feel significant." Julian scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes. "Save the philosophical garbage for your homeless shelter, Ella. In the real world, you are nothing. And at the Royal Gala next week, when my firm secures the Duchy grant, I'll be sitting at the head table with the Duchess herself, and you'll still be riding the subway." I held his gaze for a long, terrible moment. "We will see exactly where everyone sits at the gala, Julian. I said softly. I turned away from him completely, dismissing him entirely from my presence. I took Arthur's arm. Let's go, Arthur. The air in here has suddenly become incredibly stale. As we walked away, I could feel Julian's arrogant, mocking laughter following us, but inside my chest, a cold, absolute resolve had finally settled. It was time to end the charade. It was time for the Duchess to return to Oakhaven. Trust me, you won't believe what happens next. The satisfaction you are about to feel is unmatched. The night of the Royal Centenary Gala arrived. The grand ballroom of the Oakhaven Civic Center was a sea of glittering diamonds, bespoke tuxedos, and priceless silk gowns. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars cast a warm golden glow over the city's elite. A classical orchestra played softly in the background. Julian was in his element. He was aggressively working the room, shaking hands, laughing too loudly at the mayor's jokes, and boasting loudly to anyone who would listen about how his firm, and specifically his project, was a lock for the Duke's multi-million-dollar developmental grant. He was practically vibrating with arrogance, waiting for the arrival of the elusive Duchess. I, however, was not in the ballroom. I was standing 3 miles away on the private tarmac of the ancestral estate, wearing the traditional ceremonial regalia of the ruling family. I wore a sweeping floor-length gown of the deepest midnight blue, embroidered with intricate gold threading that mapped out the history of the city. Around my neck rested the heavy, priceless diamond and sapphire choker that had belonged to my grandmother. My hair was swept up into a flawless, intricate style, holding the delicate silver diadem of the duchy, and on my right index finger I wore the physical symbol of my absolute authority, the heavy, solid gold signet ring bearing the crest of the Oakhaven oak tree. "Are you ready, Your Grace?" asked Captain Reynolds, the head of my personal royal guard. He was dressed in a pristine, striking burgundy uniform with heavy gold braiding across the chest. I took a deep, steadying breath. I thought of the rain. I thought of Julian's cruel laugh. And I thought of Arthur's kind, protective eyes. "I am ready, Captain. Let us proceed." The journey to the Civic Center was a strictly orchestrated display of absolute power. 6 massive, heavily armored black SUVs moved in a tight, flawless diamond formation down the center of the city streets. The police had cleared the route. The flashing blue and red lights painted the buildings as we passed. Inside the grand ballroom, the mayor was standing at the main podium, tapping the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the mayor's voice echoed through the massive space. The orchestra immediately stopped playing. "Please direct your attention to the grand double doors. It is my profound, distinct honor to announce the arrival of our benefactor, the leader of our great city." Julian, standing near the front of the stage with his colleagues, puffed out his chest. A greasy, expectant smile plastered across his face. He smoothed his tie, ready to network with royalty. Outside, the sound cue was impossible to ignore. The deep, heavy, synchronized hum of 6 massive engines grew louder and louder until it resonated in the floorboards of the ballroom. The massive, 20-foot-tall mahogany double doors were suddenly thrown open by 4 guards in striking burgundy and gold uniforms. The silence that followed was absolute. I stepped into the doorway. The light from the chandeliers caught the diamonds at my throat and the silver of the diadem in my hair. I stood tall, my posture rigid, projecting an aura of completely untouchable authority. Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his voice booming out across the silent, stunned room. "Presenting Her Grace Alara Vance, the Duchess of Oakhaven, Protector of the City Trust." The crowd gasped as one. But I wasn't looking at the crowd. My eyes immediately found Julian. The reaction beats were spectacular. It was like watching a building demolish in slow motion. First, the color completely and violently drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sickly ghost. His jaw went slack. The expensive crystal champagne flute he was holding slipped through his trembling fingers and shattered violently against the marble floor. He didn't just look shocked, he looked completely existentially terrified. He looked like someone watching their entire world, their entire carefully constructed reality, collapse into dust. I began to walk down the central aisle. The crowd instantly parted for me like the Red Sea, bowing their heads respectfully as I passed. I walked at a slow, deliberate, measured pace. I didn't look left, I didn't look right. I walked directly, purposefully toward where Julian was frozen in horror. As I approached, his colleagues instinctively backed away from him, sensing the localized gravity of the impending disaster. Julian was left standing completely alone, a solitary, trembling figure in his expensive suit. I stopped exactly 3 feet in front of him. Up close, the panic in his eyes was almost intoxicating. He was shaking. He opened his mouth, stammering, desperately trying to form words, desperately trying to compute how the pathetic charity case he abandoned in the freezing rain was now standing before him, holding the fate of his entire career in her hands. Your, your grace, Julian stuttered, his voice cracking, high-pitched and completely pathetic. I, I didn't, Ella, I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice even a fraction of an inch. My tone was calm, measured, and absolutely devastatingly cold. You didn't want to know, I said. My voice carried clearly in the silent room. Everyone was watching, everyone was listening. Julian swallowed hard, sweat suddenly beading on his forehead. I. If I had known who you were, I would never have. I know, I interrupted smoothly, cutting him off like a blade. If you had known my status, you would have been charming. You would have been polite. You would have pretended to be a good man. But that is exactly why I hid it, Julian, because cruelty always reveals the perpetrator, never the victim. Julian was visibly trembling now. He looked around the room, making desperate eye contact with the city elite he had been trying to impress just minutes before. But the public witnesses immediately turned their eyes away, ostracizing him instantly. No one was going to save him. You chose cruelty when kindness cost you absolutely nothing, I continued, my voice echoing slightly. You judged my worth by the clothes I wore and the title you thought I lacked. You abandoned a woman in a freezing storm because you felt you were superior. You revealed exactly who you are. Please, Julian whispered, a desperate, pathetic attempt at social recovery. The grant, my firm, my career is riding on. I slowly raised my right hand, allowing the heavy gold signet ring to catch the chandelier light. I have reviewed the developmental grant proposals for the city, I announced, projecting my voice so the entire ballroom could hear. The proposal submitted by Sterling Wealth Management, led by Mr. Julian Cross, is hereby permanently rejected by the Duchy. A collective, shocked murmur rippled through the crowd. Julian's knees visibly buckled slightly. His career was over. He was professionally radioactive. No firm in the city would ever hire the man who had personally insulted and alienated the Duchess of Oakhaven. These are simply consequences, Julian, I said softly, stepping in closer, so only he could hear my final words. Worth isn't measured in stock portfolios, luxury cars, or family trees. It is measured in character. And you, Julian, are completely bankrupt. I really won't regret this. I didn't wait for his response. I turned away completely, dismissing him from my reality as easily as one swats away a bothersome fly. I didn't look back as he stood there, isolated, broken, and utterly humiliated in front of the entire city. I walked back up the aisle, my eyes scanning the room, until I found the one person I actually cared to see. Arthur was standing near the back, near the coat check. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing his simple black suit. He looked absolutely stunned, his amber eyes wide as he processed the revelation. I walked directly up to him. The crowd watched with bated breath. "Arthur," I said softly, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through my royal composure. "Ella?" he whispered, his voice full of wonder but not fear. "Or should I say, Your Grace?" "To you, just Alara," I replied. I held out my hand to him. "I owe you an apology for keeping this from you, and I believe I owe you another cup of hot chocolate, if you're still willing to be seen with me." Arthur looked at my hand, then up at my eyes. Slowly, a warm, beautiful smile spread across his face. He didn't bow, he didn't grovel. He simply reached out and took my hand, his grip just as steady and reassuring as it had been the night he held the umbrella over me in the rain. "I know a great 24-hour place," Arthur said. I took the arm of my ally, the man who had seen my true worth before he ever saw my crown, and together we exited the grand ballroom, leaving the silence and the wreckage of Julian's ambition behind us. 2 years later, the morning sun streamed beautifully through the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows of the royal estate's sunroom. I was sitting on the plush velvet sofa, wearing comfortable faded jeans and an oversized sweater. Arthur was sitting across from me, a pencil tucked behind his ear, sketching out the final blueprints for the new, Duchy-funded community center we were building on the Lower East Side. He was now the lead architect for all of the city's public works projects. We were married last spring in a quiet, private ceremony in the estate gardens. No press, no paparazzi, just the people who mattered. As for Julian, after being fired from Sterling Wealth Management, he was blacklisted from the financial sector in Oakhaven. The last I heard, he had sold his luxury sedan to pay off his debts and had moved out of the city entirely, taking a low-level administrative job in a small rural town miles away from anyone he used to try and impress. He lost exactly what he valued most: his status, his money, and his social standing. I set down my cup of tea and looked at my husband, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. I didn't have to hide anymore. I could be the Duchess and I could be Alara all at once. Listen to me carefully, because this is the most important part of the story. Worth exists completely independent of recognition. Your value is not determined by the labels on your clothing, the balance in your bank account, or the title on your business card. The right person, the true people in your life, will see your worth long before they know your status. They will show up for you in the inconvenient, messy, raining moments of life. Cruelty is a loud, desperate cry for importance, but it always inevitably reveals the emptiness of the perpetrator, never the victim. True victory isn't found in screaming matches or petty revenge. True victory is maintaining your dignity, stating your boundaries, and living incredibly unapologetically well. Have you ever had to walk away from someone who didn't see your true value? Share your story in the comments. I want to read them. If you found value in this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We have so many more stories to tell. Remember, no matter who has underestimated you, your story isn't over. Keep your head high, keep your heart kind, and the right things will find you.